This is how I make these quirky square-based pottery mugs, which are perfect if you like a nice big mug of tea or coffee. When I'm rolling clay, the first thing that I do is I flatten the clay with the heel of my hand. It makes it easier to begin the rolling process. I roll the clay on canvas that's been stretched over plywood. This makes a good non-stick surface for making slabs. When you roll a slab of clay, it's best to turn the clay slab over now and then, and also to change the direction that you're rolling the clay in. This ensures that you aren't stretching the clay too much in one direction. When the slab gets a bit bigger and thinner, I start to roll it on a piece of loose fabric, as it's easier to move the slab about and turn it over without stretching it. The wooden sticks on either side are roller guides, and they help to roll the slab of an even thickness. They're 3 mm wide. When I want to turn the slab over, once it's got to a certain size, I put another sheet on top, slide my hand underneath, and then flip the whole thing over. Once you've flipped it over, you can peel the top sheet off. Having a wide rolling pin is really helpful when you're working with bigger slabs. This rolling pin is actually a pasta roller. I'll put a link to it and any tools that I use in the video in the description below. Once the slab is the right size, I run a platter tool over the surface. This is the big green tool that you see. This gets rid of any texture left behind in the clay by the fabric, and it also helps to align the clay particles. I turn the slab over and I rib the other side too. You can use a regular pottery rib if you don't have a platter tool. I make this square slab mug with a template. I'll put a link in the description below so you can get a copy of the template from my online store if you'd like one. Once the clay slab is ready, I put the template in place and cut around it carefully with my clay knife. Any offcuts of clay can be wedged and reused, but it's also a good idea to keep any larger offcuts of clay because you will need some clay slab a little bit later to make the base of the mug too. When I'm cutting along the curved edge of the slab, I find it helpful to run both hands along the edge. I put my free hand on the paper template. That way my fingers don't stick on the clay, but running my fingers up against the knife helps to steady the knife, so I cut a nice smooth curve. I peel away the template. Then I run a damp sponge along the shorter curve of the slab. This edge is going to be the lip of the mug, and it's easier to smooth it off when the clay is flat. I turn the slab over, and then I smooth the other side of the rim too. The clay is very soft now, so I need to put it to one side to let it firm up a little. In order to turn it over, I put a couple of sheets of paper on top, and then I use a flexible chopping board. Then I can slide my hand under and flip the clay over. This way you can move the slab about without stretching it or losing its shape. Then I get a wooden drying board and I slide the slab off the chopping board onto the wood to let it firm up. In the meantime, I'm going to make the base. I use a square paper template for the base. You can cut along the straight edges of a template like this with a ruler, or you can do it freehand. If I'm cutting it freehand, I use my fingers on my left hand to support the clay knife and keep it steady. This keeps me from cutting a wonky line and prevents the knife from drifting into the soft paper template. Once I've cut this out, I need to put it to one side to let it firm up too. Lifting the slab with the paper template in place will give a bit of support and stop the slab from stretching and losing its shape. Now I'm making the handle. I'm using 6 mm roller guides for the handle, as I find a slightly thicker handle a bit more comfortable to hold. I start off with the clay roughly in the shape of a sausage. I roll it out, again rolling it in both directions. Then I transfer it onto the loose fabric so it's easier to pick up, and I use the platter tool just to smooth it out again, smoothing it out on both sides. I put the template in position and I cut along the sides of the template using a straight edge, and then I trim it to length. Once it's cut to length, I smooth out the sides of the handle with the sponge, just because it's easier to do it when the handle is straight. Curve it into position, and then I just put it on a drying board and I let it firm up until it's soft leather hard, ready to be attached. Once the big clay slab that makes up the wall of the mug is a bit firmer, I bevel both edges. These are the short ends. Beveling means that you're cutting the clay at an angle. I do this so that when I join the two ends, the clay overlaps and you can create a better join. I bevel the clay by holding the knife at about a 45-degree angle. Then I draw it along the end of each slab. It's important to turn the slab over and bevel the other side in the same way. If you don't turn the clay over, the two beveled edges won't overlap when they meet up. When the clay has been beveled, I score into the edges using my clay scoring tool. This creates a rough texture on the ends of the slab. I score in both directions to create a sort of a cross-hatch texture. Again, you have to turn the clay over and score into the other beveled edge too. Once both ends have been scored, I pick the slab up and curve it around. At this point, the clay is still soft enough to curve easily, but it can hold its own weight and it's not so soft that it'll lose its shape. I'm just transferring the clay cone onto a banding wheel there. A banding wheel is a rotating turntable, which is really handy if you are hand building. When the clay has been curved into a cone shape, I apply slip to both scored edges. Slip is just clay dissolved in water. You can use regular slip, or you can just use plain water or vinegar. I then join the two edges and press them together. I squeeze the clay gently. It's helpful to put your hand inside the cone and then just press the two surfaces together, supporting the clay slab on the inside. And when I'm pressing, the fingers on the inside of the slab are pushing in one direction, and then the fingers on the outside are pressing gently in the other direction, just to create a nice firm bond. So just go over it gently a few times, and then when the surfaces feel like they're stuck together, you can use a rubber rib just to wipe away some of that excess slip, and then go over it with the rubber rib. And using the rubber rib is a good way of creating a nice smooth surface on the outside, but it also really helps to compress those two surfaces together to make sure that they don't open up when the clay is drying. I then use a wooden tool to blend the seam on the inside of the mug too. Then, when it's blended at one end, I use my platter tool to smooth out any texture that has been left behind by the wooden modelling tool. If you don't have a platter tool like this, you can use something like the smooth back of a spoon. Once it's smoothed at one end, I turn it over and I just repeat the process on the other end. So again, using the modelling tool just to blend the seam in on the inside, and then smoothing it away with the platter tool. And you might find that there's a little bump in the clay where the seam is, so I just trim that off with my clay knife, turn it over, and then just do the same thing at the other end. Once the seam has been blended in, it's a good idea to let the mug sit for a little while just to make sure that the two sides stick together properly. So I put a piece of plastic down on the wooden board to stop the clay from drying out too much. And I put an old container in the rim of the mug just to make sure it's nice and round. And then after a little while, what I'll do is I'll start to shape the mug. This is the guide that I use to shape the bottom of the mug into the nice square shape. It consists of a square with rounded corners and two diagonal lines that intersect with one another. I put the mug over the square and I look into the rim of the mug and I make sure that the point at which the two diagonal lines intersect is right in the middle of the circular rim. And when I'm sure that the mug is sitting right over the centre of the guidelines, what I do is I gently squeeze the clay so that the clay slab begins to take on the shape of the square that's on the paper, the square outline on the paper. It doesn't need to be perfect the first time you go around. I just do it gradually just to make sure that the clay slab is going to fit all the way around the square that is on the paper. What you might find when you're shaping and squeezing the clay, you might find that tiny little cracks appear in the corner of the mug where the clay has been bent. Don't worry about that, you can just smooth them out with your finger and just keep working your way around the mug and just shaping the clay slab so it is taking on the shape of the square that's on the paper. And I use a platter tool as well just to knock it a little bit, just to make sure that the side is nice and flat, but a ruler would do. And then I'm just going to put the container in the rim again, just to keep it nice and round, and you see there that actually the side is bulging out just a little bit. You can leave it with a bit of a curve on if you want to leave the edges with a bit of a curve so it's bellying out a bit, or if you want you can flatten the sides as well. As you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just using the tips of my fingers just to gently press the side of the mug in so that the side is a bit straighter. Once I'm happy with the shape, I let the mug sit for a while to become leather hard. Because this mug has been made from an arc-shaped slab of clay, you'll see that the edges of the mug are slightly rounded. What I want to do is I want to flatten the bottom sides of the mug off so that they sit flat against the base of the mug. So I'm using a shredding tool and I'm just shredding away some of the clay to get rid of the little curve shape on the edge of the base to give it a flat edge. And then I'm using my serrated rib tool and just scoring into the now flattened edges of the mug to create a scored texture. You can use the clay scoring tool or a serrated rib or even a fork. This is the base of the mug. I'm just going to put my maker's mark on one side now. And then I just turn it over. It's on a piece of paper just to stop it from sticking to the wooden board. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the base of the mug. I'm just scoring into the surface, the edge of the surface. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want the bottom of the mug and the base of the mug to bond together really well. I don't want the two pieces of clay to crack and separate when they're drying. Then I apply a generous amount of slip to both scored surfaces. And then I lower the mug into place, and then you can wiggle it around just a little bit just to get it into position to make sure it's right in the centre of the base, and the base is just a bit wider than the bottom of the mug, and that's deliberate. It's just so that you've got a bit of wiggle room and you can trim off the excess. What I tend to do is I just trim off a bit and I leave about 1 millimetre, maybe a little bit more, of clay overhanging the base of the mug, and that will just give me enough to blend the base of the mug onto the bottom of the mug. And then once it's trimmed, I use a wooden tool just to, like I say, blend that little overhang of clay onto the bottom of the mug. Now the wooden tool will have left a few marks there, so what I do is I go around with the rubber rib and I just use that to smooth out as many of those marks as I can. Using my wooden tool just to trim away a little bit of that base, because with clay you don't want any edges to be really hard and sharp, because once it's been fired, a hard sharp edge, particularly if it's on functional pottery like a mug, is more likely to chip and break. So I just paring away a little bit of the base, then I'm turning it over. You can peel off that piece of paper, and then I just carry on the process of tidying up the edge and softening it off too. So I'm using the flat edge of a clay modelling tool, and then I use the clay knife just to get rid of any little burrs of clay that might have appeared on the base too. Smooth it with my finger, and then I'm using a damp piece of chamois leather, and I'm just again getting rid of any marks that have been left behind by the wooden tools, and also just softening off the edge. Now that the outside of the mug is tidied up, I'm turning it the right way up again, put a piece of plastic down just so that the wood doesn't dry the base out too quickly, and then I'm just going to run a bit of slip around the bottom inside edge. I'm just going around the bottom edge just to make sure that there isn't any rough texture left behind by the serrated rib tool, and just smoothing in the join. And then just put that container back in just to round the rim off again. And now I'm going to add the handle. I hold the handle in my hand and see where it feels comfortable, and then I make a mark with my thumbnail on the handle where I'm going to trim it. Just put it back on its little wooden board and use my clay knife to trim it to length. And then I'm just going to pare away at some of the clay just to give it a little bit of a curve so that the clay handle sits against the round side of the mug, because I'm going to attach this on one of the corners of the mug, so it's going to be sitting against curved clay. So I just cut a little bit of it away just to create a bit of a curved finish. Then I hold it up against the mug and just decide where I'm going to position it. Make sure it's straight, make a few adjustments, and then when I'm happy with where it is, I just use my clay knife to mark onto the mug where the clay is going to be attached. And take the handle away, and then I'm using my serrated rib tool. You can use a clay scoring tool or a fork, and just again scoring that texture to make sure that the handle stays really firmly on the mug. And again, scoring in on the bottom and on the ends of the handles too. I apply some slip to the scored areas, and then just put the handle in position and gently press it into place. It's a good idea to put your hand on the inside of the mug so that you can apply a bit of pressure to the handle without losing the shape of the mug too. So press it in place, give it a bit of a wiggle, try and make the bonders as firm as you can. Once it's in position, I like to add a little clay coil around the join. So roll a tiny little coil of clay, wrap it around where the handle meets the mug, and then I'm just using a fine wooden tool just to press that coil into position. And then once it's in position, I just use the wooden tool just to blend that coil into the clay, blending it onto the handle and also blending it onto the mug itself as well. It makes a nice neat join, and also it makes sure that the handle's attached to the mug very firmly. And then I repeat the process with the bottom part of the handle too. Adding a coil, pressing it into position, and then blending it on. And then once it's attached, I use a damp chamois leather and I just go over it and I get rid of any marks that have been left behind by the modelling tool, make a nice smooth finished surface. And there's the square based mug with the handle attached, all ready to be dried and then glazed. There's a link in the description if you'd like to get a copy of the template from my online store. Thanks for watching, bye!